We're going to go from St. George in the south. We're going to head all the way up to Ogden to Alan, who has a question for you on the Patriot Act. Alan, you're on with Senator Lee.
Hello, Alan.
Good evening, Senator Lee. I have kind of like a twofold question.
Okay.
I'm kind of concerned, are you in favor or not in favor of voting for, to renew the Patriot Act? And what are your feelings about the NSA and the high power that they have, in invading our privacy?
Okay, great question, Alan, and I'm very pleased to answer both parts of your question. I'm not in favor of reauthorizing the Patriot Act without significant reforms. And the reason for that relates to my answer to your second question, which is that the NSA right now claims to have the power to collect information on every phone call made by every American from every phone number in America for 5 years at a time and put that in one big database where they can analyze anyone's calling patterns. Now, they insist that there are only a few dozen people who work at the NSA who have access to that database, and that's fine. I'm willing to assume for purposes of this discussion that the fine men and women who work at the NSA aren't currently abusing that authority or that access. But that isn't really the point. You see, the point is the way they gather this data is itself bad, and it sets a dangerous precedent, one that could become vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. If you remember a few years ago, about 40 years ago, there was a panel convened within the United States Senate called the Church Commission. The Church Commission issued a report in which it said that every presidential administration, from FDR through Nixon, had used the federal government's intelligence gathering agencies to engage in political espionage. We know how this movie ends. We've seen it before. We don't want it to repeat itself with this newer technology. And the fact is, Alan, the federal government has no business collecting data on your calling patterns. Now, while it's true that they're not listening in to your phone calls through this program, they're just collecting data on who you call and who calls you, when the calls are made, and how long they last. But from that data, they can tell all kinds of things about you. If they wanted to, they could tell what your religion is, what your political affiliation might be, how politically active you are, how healthy you are, what kinds of health conditions you might suffer from, what your interests are. That's really none of the government's business. And we know that sooner or later, somebody, perhaps a year down the road, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years down the road, is likely to abuse that. That's why I'm not in favor of reauthorizing Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Not unless, of course, we have significant reforms. That's why I've introduced in the United States Senate a great bill called the USA Freedom Act. The USA Freedom Act, which was co-sponsored by my friend Pat Leahy, a liberal Democratic senator from Vermont. He's a liberal Democrat, and I'm not. But we do agree on this issue, that the federal government has no business tracking your calling data. It's none of the government's business. And so the USA Freedom Act says that they can't collect information like this unless they can hook that information up to some kind of legitimate investigation into foreign intelligence gathering activity. I'm pleased to report, Alan, that just a few hours ago today, the House of Representatives passed the House version of our bill, the USA Freedom Act, by a vote of 338. That's an enormous vote. That's a vote that's about 50 votes north of the threshold required for a two-thirds supermajority that would be necessary to override a presidential veto. Now, this legislation will come over to the Senate. We'll have an opportunity to review and vote on the USA Freedom Act in the United States Senate. It's going to be more difficult to get the votes we need in the Senate for the USA Freedom Act. But your freedom and mine depends on it. Our ability to live in a land where we're not subject to a government that thinks it's just fine to spy on its own people depends on our willingness to stand up to big government and to say no to excessive overreach of this sort and to say yes to the needed reforms in the USA Freedom Act. So if you agree with me on this, help spread the word. Help spread the word to your friends, your neighbors, your family members, and help spread the word to anyone serving in the United States Senate that they should support and vote for the USA Freedom Act.